Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well because today we're looking at the debut from Sum 41. Why are we looking at the debut of Sum 41? I mean, one, it's a great album, we'll talk about that. But also Sum 41, for those of you who don't know, a Canadian pop punk band who recently announced their split. They'll be breaking up next year. They're going to do one more album, one more kind of massive world tour, and then they're calling it a day, calling it quits. So I thought it'd be really fun to kind of go through their discography, starting with their debut right here. This is Sum 41, Half Hour of Power, including the space between tracks. It's a full half hour, slightly under if you get rid of that. So the band formed in Ajax, Ontario in 1996. This release came out in the year 2000. In the States, it's on Island Records. In Canada, it's on Aquarius Records. And the really cool thing about Sum 41 is that it's sort of the generation of pop punk bands that were inspired by the generation that was inspired by the originators of the genre, if that makes sense. So you have these kind of early 90s bands inspired by the likes of, the Ramones and Screeching Weasel and kind of the 80s, late 70s into the 80s, that scene. But then you get these bands that grew up listening to, Green Day, grew up listening to kind of the earlier Rancid and NoFX and those Berkeley bands. And then that's where you get sort of Blink 182, Sum 41, a lot of those sort of groups. And I think something kind of interesting is that image you get, that sort of like Billabong, Warped Tour, late 90s, early 2000s teen movie kind of images that go along with pop punk. That's sort of different than that Green Day of sort of being um, misunderstood and downtrodden. Now it's sort of misunderstood and celebratory. I wouldn't necessarily say that Sum 41 is sort of Canada's Blink 182. Stylistically, they're very different, but I think image-wise, they sort of carried that same torch, which is a really cool thing to think about. So this is their debut here, and it has a lot. It's got a lot to say. It's a pretty good debut. I think it gives a really good idea of where the band would go moving forward, both in terms of their immediate follow-up. So depending on where you look and who you ask, this is either their debut album or it's an EP. I think of it as an album. I always did until doing some more research for this. Some people say it's an EP. So if it's an EP, let's say, this offers kind of a look at where their debut album would go. That one is a lot more poppy. And then throughout their career, they kind of returned to a lot of the metal stuff that they've got on here. So it actually starts with a tune called "Grab the Devil by the Horns" and boop 'em up the bat. That sort of brings in this idea. They have this fake metal band called Pain for Pleasure that they would carry through a couple of their next few albums. And so this is sort of a galloping twin guitar intro to the album, reminiscent of like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden. It's a lot of fun. It's just a fun little metal tune that's done pretty well. It's parody, but it's parody done to a really strong degree, and we see that later in the album as well. Um, and then second track, here's Machine Gun, pretty good standard pop punk. Um, Track 3 is What I Believe. It's not the single that was taken from this EP or album. I'll call it an album, not the single that was taken from this, but it would have been a good contender. I think What I Believe is a strong choice. Track number 4, TNT, that's just sort of like a hardcore punk song, really fast, brings in some of their skate punk elements too. Track 5 was the single, Makes No Difference. I think a lot of folks remember that, seeing that video on Much Music at the time, 2000s. I think that also made it into a few soundtracks. It was on the Van Wilder soundtrack and Bring It On. Cool. I believe it got a re-recorded version as well. The version on here is good, but then you listen to the re-recorded version where they have, a stronger budget and the label had more effort put behind the band, and you kind of realize that a lot of the wrinkles on this release, a lot of things that don't sound as perfect, are partly due to the budget that they were working with at the time. Um, Track 6 on here is called Summer. That would actually get re-recorded for their follow-up album, All Killer No Filler, which makes sense. It's a lot poppier and emotive on that one. This one, it still has a lot of those elements, but it's more of a poppier and emotive track. Track number 7 on here, 32 Ways to Die, is another little drum solo intro into the next song, which is track 8, Second Chance for Max Headroom. That's sort of their, as much as it could be, their technical showcase for skate punk and pop punk. It has it was a style at the time, ska breakdown, that a lot of pop punk and punk bands were doing. They don't have a regular horn section, but they do have some horns credited for the release. Track number 9, Dave's Possessed Hair, It's What We're All About. That's another one of those kind of parody-ish tracks. So it starts out with another kind of faster skate punk number, and then it goes into sort of a rap rock bit that they would feature in some of their follow-up music videos, and they would perform, and that again would be a theme they'd carry through. And it's just like a rap about who each band member is, which I'll get to in a sec, and what they're all about. And apparently it's rock. That's what they live for, and that's what they're all about. So that's good to know. I'm glad they cleared that up. So who do you have in the band? Let's get to that, and then we'll get back to the rest of the track. So you have Busy D, which is Derek Whibley, who's the lead vocalist and guitar player and has been for the entire time in the band. Following up, you have Hot Chocolate, or Dave Baksh, who's guitar and vocals, who left the band for a bit, is now back in the band. Third, you have Cone, or Jason McCallum, who's on bass and vocals. And then following that up, you have Steve-O32, or Steve Jazz, who's the drums. And that's the debut lineup, and that would be the lineup for the next couple of releases as well. Next up, track 10. Where are we? Ride the Chariot to the Devil. Yeah, that's another one of the metal ones. That one's a bit shorter. I think it could have been developed a bit more, but it's a shorter one. And then we've got Another Time Around, which is the closer. It's a good one. It kind of like sums up what the band is all about, which again, they've clarified as rock. So that's good. But again, Half Hour of Power for a band's debut and for as popular as Sum 41 would become. It's like humble beginnings, but it's pretty strong. It gives you a really good idea when you listen to this of where they can go and what they can do. But it's really fun to listen to that in that early 2000s context of that sort of inspired by the inspirers pop punk explosion that we saw, and kind of looking back and thinking about the images that these sorts of bands portrayed and how they went about doing that and how that came across through their music. And I think that's a really cool thing to do. So I think my hope is to continue this, go through Sum 41 as a band, which I'm excited to do because I only really listened to their first, if I count this as an album, their first 3 albums. I didn't follow on from Chuck afterwards, not because I didn't like the direction they went in. I think just my own musical taste changed, or I got into other bands or whatever. So I'm more familiar with, All Killer No Filler, and then the follow-up was Does This Look Infected? But from Chuck onwards, I don't know. We'll see. It'll be exciting to hear. But that said, here is Sum 41's debut, All Killer No Filler. And by that, I mean Half Hour of Power. Yes. Great. Awesome. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye.